Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Sean Wiswasser. He's a former CIA officer and also an author. He recently published a book that's going out about Russian intelligence and surveillance and basically the tactics that Russia users will be discussing the book and the conclusions and inferences that can be drawn from Sean's years of experience on the subject. Sean, I wanted to give you the floor to tell us a little bit more in depth about your background, your book, and where the readers can find it.
Sure. So, Irina, thank you for the chance to talk with you and your listeners about these important subjects. My book's over my shoulder there. It's Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. It's available on Amazon for pre-order. It's in bookstores on 21 April and already shipping out from Naval Institute Press. So it's available now. The book is unique because it's 10 chapters focused on Russian intelligence tradecraft, meaning how they do, of course, their work. As Russian intelligence officers would say, правила конспирации. So how they do dead drops, how they do surveillance, how they do active measures. So it's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. I know we're going to talk about that for a little bit today. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So your forthcoming book examines Russian intelligence tradecraft as a professional culture. What enduring operational principles continue to define how Russian intelligence officers are trained today?
Yeah, so very good question, Irina. What I touch on in chapter 1 of the book while dealing with the history of the FSB, the SVR, the GRU, and their Soviet predecessors. The overriding principle is, of course, corruption. Corruption is endemic to what was the KGB, now the SVR and now the SVR and FSB that broke off from the KGB. And it's endemic to the GRU, or what previously was OGPU. It's always been a part of their culture. So one of the most important things I get to in chapter 1 of the book is talking about a day in the life of a Russian intelligence officer. And from the Russian agents that I worked with, those intelligence officers who worked as assets for the United States, as I relate in the book, this is a huge part of their everyday life, working for their intelligence agencies. Scams, schemes, patronage networks, very much like a mafia culture. And so that's the overriding principle, I believe. I think a lot of Russian intelligence officers that I knew, both professionally as agents and even some that I had the occasion to deal with in official capacities, is what we would say liaison, that I met abroad. I don't think they would hide that. For the most part, they know corruption is a huge part of their system. So the other aspects of their intelligence work, corruption is a criticism, of course, and one well-deserved to them. One of the things that I will give, and I do give a begrudging compliment in the book, is that the Russians do understand compartmentation in terms of intelligence operations, and they do that very well. They understand that in order to keep an operation secret and to protect it, only a few people need to know. I think that's much harder to do in democratic open societies. Everybody believes they have a right to know. So that's one of the major overriding principles on the negative side, and then on the tactical side, one of the things they do well.
Well, that's certainly worth noting as US and others are struggling to deal with the mushrooming Russian espionage and active measures and hybrid warfare around Western countries and elsewhere, that corruption is something important to understand because it can be exploited as well. But speaking of exploitation, how do Russian intelligence services approach the development of deep cover identities, and what institutional processes support the creation of credible operational legends?
Yeah, good question, Irina. So chapter 3 of the book is on Russian illegals, nelegali, which has always been a fundamental part of their intelligence operations going back 100 years. I would commend to your listeners, Sean Walker has a very good book out last year called The Illegals. And he discusses there's a 100-year history, of course. So the illegals, the principle of doing intelligence work under other identities, not just non-official cover, but actually operating under other passports of other nationalities, had its origins in the revolutionaries before the Russian Revolution. Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, all of them had to live under false identities. They were used to traveling abroad. And so this bled into the work of Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Dzerzhinsky, as he was called, when he set up the ЧК, the Чрезвычайный комитет, of course, the Extraordinary Committee for Defense of the Revolution, of the KGB. Illegals work was there from the very get-go, and it remains a fundamental part of SVR and GRU operations in particular. I mentioned in the book I worked the Ghost Stories case, which were the 12 illegals that were wrapped up in 2010 and swapped back to the Russians. Well, since that case, we've seen only more examples of illegals wrapped up abroad. So as soon as they were arrested and deported, the Russians went right back to doing illegal work. You know, I want to mention the case of in Brazil just a year or two ago, a huge network uncovered. What did we learn about this? What happened in Brazil? The Russians were using false documentation that they had inserted into the Brazilian identity network. For anyone to get a passport, what do you need? You got to show a birth certificate. You got to show some other documentation. You know, State Department, if you want a passport, they want at least 2 free forms of IDs. They lay that all out. So what we saw in the case of that illegal network in Brazil was that the Russians had shown a lot of patience. Clearly, they had placed this false documentation many years and many decades ago into Brazilian record systems before they were digitized. And the only reason they were uncovered, Irina, of course, is because everything's being digitized nowadays. AI is helping governments. So when it was uncovered, what was found is that the Russians were using Brazil, especially as a transit point. Why? Because, of course, it's much easier to get to the United States if you have a Brazilian passport than if you have a Russian one or Belarusian one, or even many of the other Soviet states that are not part of the EU right now, like the Baltics are. So those states that it's difficult to get a visa, non-EU, other parts of the world, they were using Brazil as a transit point for the illegals. So what I would say in a short answer, it's hard to cover so much content about illegals. I hope your readers will consider buying my book. They show a lot of patience. They show determination to set up these networks. You asked about institutional structures. Yuri Drozdov, who headed Directorate S of the KGB, set up a foundational way that trained illegals. And his timeline was 7 years, 7 to 8 years to train one illegal to operate in the West. And they largely use a lot of that. There are different types of illegals. They don't train them as well. Like Anna Chapman, she was not a Stabny officer. She was not a staff officer. She was a buffoon in many ways. She was a really horrible illegal, but she was something called a special agent illegal. She didn't get all the training. So in short, they show patience, they show determination. It's always been a part of their culture, and it always will be.
Well, that's definitely something to keep in mind. I think a lot of this tradecraft has lost their attention because of so much focus on sabotage and things of that nature. But I do think it's worth keeping in mind, because if people are that patient, then they're deeply embedded and they will not get the attention, and then they'll be more successful in performing their jobs, unfortunately. With that in mind, clearly, this sort of manipulation is nothing new. And that brings me to my next question. How does Russian intelligence doctrine approach the concept of operational deception as a normal profession?
Yeah, very good question, Irina. Thank you for asking it. So maskirovka, Russian intelligence calls maskirovka, what we would refer to as denial and deception, is fundamental to everything that they do in intelligence operations. So we see this most clearly in active measures. So активные мероприятия, what the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, also calls measures of support, are supporting Russia's malign policies abroad. These are information operations meant to subvert and undermine democracies, especially in the West, to undermine political or foreign policy goals or things that NATO or the US or our partners are trying to accomplish. And so in these information operations is where we see this concept of maskirovka most clearly. You know, it's fundamental to everything that they do. Let me give an example I talk about in my book, the Active Measures chapter. I talk about the meddling in the 2016 election. And I make my focus, of course, on the fact that the Russians were attacking our very democracy. That the goal, the overarching goal, was not support against any 401 candidate, but more fundamental against the entire structure. And so this is where you see competing and false narratives that the Russians helped put out there, or they took advantage of a narrative already there and they amplified it. So they were meddling, they were hyping up the emotion on different groups of voters. You pick the issue: guns rights, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ issues. Where the American populace happened to be on an issue, Russian trolls were arguing both sides of these debates at the same time. And that was substantiated by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report and the DNI report, both of which were bipartisan. So what's an example of maskirovka? Maskirovka is then the Russians trying to find somebody else to blame. So in the midst of all of that, and again in 2020, you see these ideas float in like the Venezuelans were attacking the US system. It was Venezuelan machines being accessed by the evil Maduro government. Now, I'm glad Maduro's is gone as much as any other dictator, but they didn't have a damn thing to do with meddling in our election. And, you know, Attorney General Barr said himself, we looked into that, and his words were, it was bullshit. So that's an example. The Russians amplified that, and they continue to amplify those kind of myths and distrust. And oh, here's another thing that the Americans can't trust about the electoral system. You can't trust the Egypt. You know, I worked for decades with the FBI. They're not perfect. No American intelligence agency or federal government agency is. But I worked with thousands of really dedicated people that would never allow our democracy to be compromised without investigating thoroughly. Department of Justice, FBI, and many other federal agencies investigated all of those and found there was no compromise of electoral systems. Why do the Russians do it? Again, maskirovka, Irina. Let's get the Americans fighting with each other. Let's get them do our bidding. That's the essence of active measures and the idea of maskirovka.
Definitely. But I think also part of the problem is that we allow them to do it well. We sort of buy into the nonsense, and we kind of go along with these false flag operations and blame shifting and obvious misuse of equipment in other places and countries. You know, I think a lot will need to be reviewed moving forward if we are honest with ourselves about who our adversaries are and how they operate and how they're trying to get the best of us. And these operations, they do not mean well for us. They're not just necessarily a normal process of intelligence gathering. A lot of it has a clear adversarial element. And that is why this level of blame shifting is so important. That said, there's another well-known thing about Russian reputation. It's a surveillance state. It's a police state. Now, with the rise of SIGINT, of electronic surveillance, of mass surveillance, you know, the concept has gotten a little bit diluted in the sense that everyone's paying attention to the machines and the technologies, and people are basically trying to compare US to Russia and so on and so forth. But let's kind of move away a little bit from this electronic mass surveillance and who is better at it and who does it the right way. And let's look at the classic approach. What distinguishes the way Russians do physical surveillance tradecraft from purely technical surveillance approaches that we are all kind of familiar with?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So why don't we make this, well, this will be the last one in English, then I know we're going to jump into a couple questions in Russian, right, Irina? So I'll answer this one in English, if that's okay, and then we'll jump into some of our Russian questions. So the Russians, but I always try to share in the book, I share a lot of Russian terminology. So наружное наблюдение, or following surveillance, trailing surveillance, using physical means has always been something that the Russian intelligence services are very good at. This dates back to Soviet times and then even before Soviet times. This dates to the time of the Tsar's secret police called the Okhrana. So Russian culture and society and Soviet society had always had this heavy surveillance state function. I write a column for the Cipher Brief. I wrote a few months ago a column called Russia, the Modern Surveillance State. I believe that they're more of a surveillance state now than even Stasi, than East Germany was with the Stasi. If you look at the total control of Russian society today, every internet service provider, every telephone company by law has FSB officers working at it, accessing it real time. Every camera system, and the big cities have cameras everywhere. So it's a total surveillance state. And this feeds into what the Russians always were really good at. In KGB times, it was the 7th Directorate, which was in charge of surveillance. And they largely did it on foot and in vehicle. And they were supplemented sometimes by, for instance, cameras on the Moscow metro system. Well, now they have cameras, the ability to tap into cell phones. They have technical devices that are very small and very portable. So it makes for a security service like the Russians have with the FSB, security service of somewhere on the order of 100,000 officers, not counting the border guards. If you count the border guards, we're talking hundreds of thousands of officers in the FSB across the country. They have a lot at their disposal. So I hope your listeners might consider buying the book. I have a whole chapter. 4 of the book is on surveillance.
So that brings me to the question for the Russian-speaking audience, and for those who don't speak Russian, there will be an English language, essentially, transcript available later.
Okay, I'm gonna just mention up front, I'm not a Russian native speaker. I learned Russian my whole life. Мне, пожалуйста, за какие-то ошибки. Но я постараюсь ответить на ваш вопрос, Ирина. Российские спецслужбы свои профессиональные терминологии называют оперативное прикрытие словом «крыша». Тогда как у нас чаще говорят оперативное прикрытие или прикрытие для действия. Конечно, крыша тоже имеется в виду здесь тоже разные значения насчет организованной преступности и так далее. При этом россияне и русские разведчики исторически не очень сильно в этой области. Причина довольно простая. В течение десятилетий, совсем недавно в российских посольствах в Европе и США работали десятки и иногда и сотни разведчиков, размещенных в крупных дипломатических миссиях. В таких условиях, по сути, не нужно было задумываться об оперативном прикрытии. Они опирались на такие называемые статусное прикрытие, то есть официальный дипломатический статус. На массовость ситуация резко изменилась после высылки сотен российских сотрудников в результате событий 2022 года. Теперь им приходится работать в условиях, где необходимо настоящее оперативное прикрытие. Понимать, как скрывать реальные цели, как действовать незаметно. Судя по всему, с этим возникают серьезные трудности.
Вопрос. Как российские спецслужбы определяют понятие агентурной работы в рамках общего разведывательного процесса?
Да, хороший вопрос, Ирина, спасибо. Что касается агентурной работы в российской практике, это один из ключевых элементов всей разведывательной деятельности. То есть полный цикл работы с агентурной. Поиск и вербовка источников, проверка, установка задач, информации и поддерживание связи или спецсвязи, как русские разведчики иногда говорят, если касается оперативной техники. То есть это не просто сбор данных, управление человеческим источником как система. И они очень хорошо с этим, они тренируются в этой, их академия на это очень сильно тренируется. Но здесь снова возникает проблема коррупции. Вот опять же коррупция в российских службах. Когда речь идет об агентурной работе, существует проблема с фабрикованных дел. То есть, даю пример. Я рассказываю в своей книге, как один очень высокопоставленный офицер СВР, Сергей Третьяков, он работал в США, и он говорил мне, когда он работал в резидентуре Нью-Йорка, он рассказал об этом, как он сотрудники свои всегда спрашивал своих молодых офицеров, разведчиков, это дело, на которое вы сейчас работаете, настоящее ли, или это просто для отчета? То есть это выдуманное ли оно на информации из открытых источников, таких как газеты? Это была распространенная практика в первом главном управлении КГБ, которое стало потом СВР после распада Союза. И это сейчас и существует в современной сфере ГРУ. То есть это реальное дело, это реальный агент. Или этот разведчик, он собрал материал просто из газет. Ну, для меня, Ирина, это было что-то. Когда я слышал от Сергея Третьякова, как же это...
Еще очередной вопрос и заключительный. Как российские сотрудники разведки описывают взаимосвязь между аналитической работой и оперативным сбором информации в своей доктринальной терминологии?
Да, хороший вопрос. Если говорить о совмещении аналитической работы и полового сбора информации, то в российской профессиональной среде обычно описывается как взаимодополняющие процессы. Добыча информации, агентурная и иная разведка, это рассматривается как основа аналитической работы, как этап обработки, оценки и обобщения полученных данных. При этом в идеале аналитика должна направлять сбор, формулируя задачи и приоритеты, а сбор, в свою очередь, впитывает аналитику новыми данными. Вот в ФСБ, например, как пример, это ну, пятая служба. Раньше был департамент, пятый департамент КГБ. Сейчас это тот департамент, это оперативный аналитический департамент или служба ФСБ. И да, Федеральная служба безопасности, их есть и службы. И вот эта пятая служба, они отвечают за анализ для президента, для Путина. И это их было, Путин рассчитывал на это, и их анализ, чтобы нападать на Украину в 2022 году. Я думаю, что у них процесс аналитика, что это сломано, и что эта коррупция опять же действует слишком много.
Thank you so much. This was a really insightful and interesting and in-depth perspective into processes that seem very mysterious to the outsiders, but also increasingly important to understand, particularly as Russian hybrid warfare, active measures, and penetrative activity seems to be expanding around the globe, and of course targeting the US increasingly more in today's polarized political atmosphere. Hopefully some lessons will be learned by both professionals and the general public alike. And for those who've listened to this program, I certainly hope you order your copy of the book and read it carefully and then read it again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. So the book, again, Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. Hope you'll consider buying it on Amazon and all the other sites. Irina, thank you for the opportunity. It was fun to do it. It's the first podcast I did also partially in Russian. Hope I did okay. I tried my best. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and best of success with your book. Hope to hear a lot more from you in the near future. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for our listeners.